In our house, silence had a sound. It wasn't the empty, peaceful quiet that settles over a home when the day is done. It was a dense, weighted thing, a presence of its own that sat with us at the dinner table. The sound of it was the deliberate, rhythmic clink of my father's fork against his plate, a small, sharp metronome counting out my every failing. Each metallic tap was a judgment, a reminder that I was being watched, measured, and, as was so often the case, found wanting. I remember the weight of the air in the dining room that evening. It was autumn in Maple Creek, the time of year when the world outside our windows was a riot of defiant color, of maples burning gold and crimson against a crisp blue sky. But inside, the world was drained of all warmth. Our dining room was my father's sanctuary of order. The mahogany table was polished to such a dark, unforgiving sheen that it reflected our faces back at us as distorted, solemn masks. The linen napkins were starched into sharp white rectangles, and the silverware was aligned with a geometric precision that allowed for no deviation. The only scent was the faint, sterile tang of lemon polish, mingling with the aroma of a pot roast that had been cooked half an hour too long, its dryness a perfect match for the conversation. My mother, Eleanor, sat opposite me. She was a ghost at these meals, a master of the art of invisibility. Her practiced stillness was a survival mechanism I had yet to learn. Her hands, when they moved, were delicate and bird-like, flitting from her water glass to her napkin, her only purpose to avoid attracting attention. She kept her gaze fixed on the precise center of her plate, a space that held nothing but pristine white ceramic. She saw the tension in my shoulders, the way I cut my dry meat into smaller and smaller pieces, pushing them around my plate to create the illusion of eating. She saw it all, and she chose to see nothing. Her silence was not an absence of words. It was a decision. My father, Richard, sat at the head of the table. He was not a large man, but he filled every room he entered, sucking the very air from it to fuel his own presence. He ate with a slow, methodical rhythm, each chew a deliberate act of consideration. It was the same way he approached everything, his business, his reputation, his family. We were all assets to be managed, variables in an equation that had to result in perfection. Tonight, one of his assets was underperforming. I could feel it lying on the table beside his plate, face down. The crisp envelope from Maple Creek Union High School, my report card. It had been there since he'd walked in the door, a silent accusation, waiting for its moment. I'd spent the entire school day in a state of low-grade panic, my stomach a cold, tight knot. I'd rehearsed my explanations, my justifications, my promises to do better. They all tasted like ash in my mouth. Please, I prayed to a God I wasn't sure I believed in. Please, just let this dinner end. Let him be too tired. Let him forget. But my father never forgot. He placed his fork and knife together across his plate, the gesture as final as a judge's gavel. The metronome stopped. The silence that followed was louder, heavier. I held my breath. My mother's hand froze on its way to her water glass. "Lily," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the stillness like a shard of glass. I forced myself to look up, to meet his gaze in the dim reflection on the table's surface. My own face looked pale and frightened. His was impassive, unreadable. "Yes, Father." My voice was a thin, reedy thing. He didn't speak again for a long moment. He simply reached out, his fingers long and elegant, and turned the envelope over. Then, he slid it across the polished wood. It stopped just short of my own plate. A formal invitation to my own execution. "I had an interesting talk with the school principal today," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "Mr. Henderson. He sends his regards. He says you are a quiet, diligent student. It was a trap. Praise was always a trap." It was the velvet glove he wore before showing the iron fist. "That's nice of him," I whispered, my fingers trembling as I reached for the envelope. The paper felt cold, clinical. "It is," my father agreed, a slight, humorless smile touching his lips. "He thinks you have potential, a word I am beginning to grow tired of." Potential is simply another word for a job not yet done. I pulled the single sheet of paper from the envelope. I already knew what it said. I had stared at it for an hour in my bedroom the day before, my eyes tracing the neat, typed letters and numbers as if they belonged to someone else. Math, A. English, A. Chemistry, A. Physical education, A. History, a B+. That single damning letter sat there, an island of imperfection in a sea of excellence. It was a brand. My father leaned forward slightly. The scent of his expensive, spicy aftershave drifted across the table. History, he stated, as if reading my mind. Everything else is in order. But history. Tell me, Lily, what is the problem with history? There's no problem, Father, I said, the rehearsed lines coming out shaky and unconvincing. It's a difficult class. Mr. Albright is a very demanding teacher. His standards are high, my father interrupted, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. As are mine. Are you suggesting his standards are unreasonable? No, of course not. It's just, the material is complex. We're covering the post-war Reconstruction period, and the essays require a lot of nuanced analysis. I thought my last paper was quite good, but he felt my thesis was underdeveloped. I was babbling, hearing the weakness in my own excuses. My father listened with a look of profound disappointment. It was his most effective weapon. Anger was a storm, loud and frightening, but it passed. Disappointment was a poison that seeped into your bones and stayed there. An underdeveloped thesis, he repeated, savoring the words as if they were a personal insult. He picked up his signet ring, which sat beside his plate, and began to tap it rhythmically on the table. Tap, tap, tap. A new metronome had begun. A miller does not have an underdeveloped anything. An underdeveloped thesis is the result of underdeveloped thinking. Underdeveloped work ethic. I worked hard on it, I pleaded, my voice cracking. I spent a week in the library. Then you worked inefficiently, he shot back, the words precise and merciless. This isn't about effort, Lily. A man who builds a crooked house can claim he worked hard. The house is still crooked. This is about results. I provide you with every opportunity. A quiet home. Books. The best school in the county. I give you everything you need to succeed, and you bring me this adequacy. He gestured toward the report card with a flick of his wrist, as if it were something unclean. A B+ is adequate. It is average. It is good enough. He paused, letting the final two words hang in the air. Then he delivered the final, familiar blow. Millers, he said, his voice cold and hard as granite, don't settle for good enough. I stared down at my hands, my knuckles white as I gripped them in my lap. There was nothing more to say. I had been weighed, I had been measured, and I had been found wanting. The hot shame of it prickled behind my eyes, but I refused to cry. Tears were a weakness he would not tolerate. Beside me, I heard the quiet scrape of my mother's chair. She began to clear the plates, her movements swift and mechanical. She was erasing the scene, wiping the slate clean so we could do it all again tomorrow. She took my plate, still heavy with the food I couldn't eat, and didn't say a word. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at my father. She simply carried the dirty dishes into the kitchen, and the swinging door sighed shut behind her, leaving me alone with my judge. Go to your room, Lily, my father said, his tone dismissive. He had already picked up the evening paper, the conflict over, my failure logged and filed away. And I expect you to spend your evening considering how you plan to rectify this situation. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady. I walked out of the dining room, past the perfectly arranged furniture in the living room, and up the carpeted stairs. Each step felt heavy, as if I were dragging the weight of his disappointment behind me. My father didn't want a daughter, I thought, as I closed my bedroom door behind me, the sound a soft click in the quiet house. He wanted a legacy. A pristine report card was just another brick in the facade of the perfect life he was building for the world to see. That night, I didn't cry because of a grade. I cried because I understood, with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul, that in my father's eyes, my worth was written on a piece of paper. A B+ meant I was a flawed component, a crack in the structure. It meant I was already a disappointment. I had no idea then how much lower I could fall. I had no idea that my father, in his quest for my perfection, was about to hand me over to the one man who would shatter me completely. The week that followed was a study in cold silence. My father's disappointment laid a frost over our home, chilling every room, every conversation. I kept my head down, did my homework with a frantic, desperate focus, and scrubbed the house until my knuckles were raw. I was a penitent, hoping my acts of contrition would earn me a reprieve. But I knew it was only a matter of time. My father was a man of action, and my B+ was a problem that required a solution. That solution, I would soon learn, was far worse than the problem itself. The solution came on a Thursday evening under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the school gymnasium. It was parent-teacher night, an event I dreaded more than any exam. It was a parade of my father's expectations, a public forum for my potential failures. We walked through the crowded hallways together, his hand resting on the back of my neck. It was not a gesture of affection. It was a gesture of ownership, a human leash to guide me to my judgment. The air smelled of floor wax, damp wool coats, and the faint, sweet perfume of other mothers. I saw my friend Grace with her parents, and she gave me a small, worried wave, but I could only offer a weak, fleeting smile in return. My father's grip tightened slightly, urging me forward. We were not there to socialize. We found Mr. Albright's designated spot in the gymnasium, a small desk set among dozens of others. He was finishing a conversation with the parents of another student, the mother laughing at something he'd said. I watched him, and a strange, cold feeling coiled in my stomach. He was handsome in a way that seemed safe, academic. He wore a tweed jacket with suede patches at the elbows, and his dark hair had a single, distinguished streak of gray at the temple. When he smiled, his whole face seemed to light up, but his eyes, even from a distance, seemed to be watching everything at once, missing nothing. They were the eyes of a hawk, scanning for weakness. When the other parents left, he saw us and stood, that brilliant smile now directed at my father. "Richard," he said, extending a hand. His voice was exactly as I remembered from class, a calm, confident baritone that commanded attention without ever needing to be raised. "Thank you for coming." "David," my father responded, his own voice losing its hard edge, replaced by the respectful tone he reserved for men he considered his equals. He shook Mr. Albright's hand firmly. "This is my daughter, Lily." Mr. Albright turned his gaze to me. For a moment, it felt like a physical touch, a clinical assessment that saw past my neatly ironed blouse and into the frantic beating of my heart. "Lily," he said, his smile softening just enough to seem kind. "It's a pleasure to see you outside the classroom." I mumbled something, a quiet, "You too," my eyes fixed on the scuffed toe of my shoe. I felt my father's hand on my neck again, a silent command to stand straighter, to look the man in the eye. He had a voice that could make poison sound like a cure. He spoke of my mind as if it were a locked room, and only he possessed the key. "Richard, I'll be direct," he began, gesturing for my father to take the small chair opposite him, a move that subtly established him as the authority in this space. I was left standing beside my father, a silent accessory to the negotiation. "Your daughter is one of the brightest students I've had in years." Truly, her grasp of historical context is remarkable for her age. I could feel my father swell with pride beside me. This was the validation he craved. This was the proof that his methods, his pressure, were working. "But," Mr. Albright continued, his tone shifting to one of serious, professional concern, "she has a barrier. She's hesitant, timid. I'll pose a question to the class, and I can see the answer in her eyes. I know she knows it, but she won't speak up. Her essays show a brilliant mind at work, but they lack aggression. The confidence to state a thesis and defend it against all comers." He was painting a masterpiece of manipulation. He had identified my father's core frustration, my perceived weakness, and was now presenting it back to him as a shared problem, a puzzle for two great men to solve. "I've seen it myself," my father said, nodding grimly. "She lacks conviction." "It's not conviction she lacks," Mr. Albright corrected gently. "It's the confidence to wield it. It's a common affliction of the highly intelligent. They see all sides of an issue, and it can lead to a kind of paralysis." He leaned forward, his voice dropping conspiratorially. And that B+ on her last report? It wasn't from a lack of knowledge, Richard. It was from a lack of scholarly boldness, and that is something we can fix. My father leaned in too, completely captivated. How? This was the moment. The offering, the hook, baited and cast. I see a rare spark in her, Mr. Albright said, his eyes flicking to me for a fraction of a second before returning to my father. And I would hate to see it extinguished by simple shyness. I'd be willing to work with her, one-on-one, after school. Perhaps twice a week. We can work through her essays line by line, engage in debates. We can build her confidence, sharpen her arguments. We can do more than just get her an A. We can unlock her true abilities. The words hung in the air, shimmering with promise. Unlock. Abilities, sharpen. They were the magic incantations that held my father in their thrall. He didn't see a teacher offering extra help. He saw a master craftsman promising to finish his flawed creation. He saw the path to the perfection he demanded. I tried to send a signal, a desperate, silent plea. I shifted my weight, looked at my father's profile, hoping he would turn, see the panic in my eyes, and hesitate. But he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his savior. "You'd be willing to do that?" my father asked, his voice filled with a gratitude that made me feel sick. "Your own time?" "A mind like Lily's is worth the investment, mister," Albright said smoothly, waving a dismissive hand. My father stood up, his face alight with a rare, genuine smile. He clapped Mr. Albright on the shoulder. "David, I don't know what to say. This is exactly what she needs." "Structure, a firm hand. We'll take you up on it." "Absolutely." And just like that, the deal was done. A handshake sealed my fate. My father saw Mr. Albright as a sculptor, and I was the marble he was handing over. He beamed, proud of the fine material he was providing, confident that this skilled artist would chip away all my imperfections and reveal the masterpiece within. He never once thought to ask the marble if it wanted to be carved. We walked away from the desk, my father's step light and triumphant, my own feet like lead. He was already talking about the future, about the A+ that was now a certainty, about the college essays I would write, about the success that was his birthright, passed down to me. I said nothing. In our family, a child's disagreement was not a point of view. It was an act of insubordination. And I had learned long ago that insubordination was a sin my father would not forgive. So I walked beside him, a silent ghost in the noisy gymnasium, the echo of Mr. Albright's kind, predatory voice ringing in my ears. I felt a cold dread settle deep in my bones, a premonition of closed doors and locked rooms. The season was changing. A long, cold winter was on its way. The first tutoring session was scheduled for the following Monday. The weekend was a strange mirage of peace. My father, placated by the promise of my academic salvation, treated me with a kind of benevolent neutrality I hadn't experienced in years. He spoke to me about current events at the dinner table as if I were a colleague, a person whose thoughts had merit. My mother, sensing the shift in the domestic weather, seemed to breathe easier, her movements less fragile, her smiles less brittle. It was a glimpse of the life I craved, a life where I was not a problem to be solved. But it was a fool's paradise. The peace was conditional, the price for it due at 3 o'clock on Monday, in room 204. I walked toward room 204 like a lamb to the slaughter, except a lamb doesn't know what's coming. I did. Not the details, not the specifics, but a deep, primal part of me knew I was walking toward a cliff in the dark. The final bell had rung 20 minutes ago. The school was already emptying out, the noisy, chaotic river of students draining away to leave behind a silent, cavernous space that felt nothing like the building I knew. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallway. The setting sun slanted through the tall windows, stretching my shadow long and thin and distorted behind me, a dark companion I couldn't shake. The door to room 204 was slightly ajar, a sliver of yellow light spilling into the dim hall. He was waiting for me. I pushed the heavy wooden door open. The classroom was unnaturally tidy. The chairs were all pushed in, the chalk tray wiped clean. The only things out of place were my history textbook and my latest essay, sitting alone in the center of a large table near the front. Mr. Albright was standing by the window, looking out at the athletic fields. He turned when I entered, and his face broke into that same warm, confident smile. "Lily, punctual, an excellent quality," he said. Come in, have a seat." I did as I was told, my bag thudding softly onto the linoleum floor beside my chair. The room was quiet, insulated from the rest of the world. He walked from the window to the door, his movements fluid and unhurried. He closed it, shutting out the dim light of the hallway. And then, with a casualness that made the action 1,000 times more sinister, he reached down and turned the bolt lock on the door. That sound, the dull, heavy thud of the bolt sliding into its brass housing, it's a sound that has never left me. In my dreams, it is sometimes the slam of a cell door, sometimes the lid of a coffin closing over me. That day, it was the sound of my world shrinking to the size of that room. It was the sound of a cage door closing. He saw the flicker of alarm in my eyes. "Just so we're not disturbed," he said smoothly, his voice a reassuring balm on a fresh wound. "The janitors can be a bit noisy with their floor buffers. I want you to be able to focus completely. This time is for you." He made it sound like a gift, a privilege. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He didn't come to the table right away. He leaned against the front of his own large desk, crossing his arms. He wasn't looking at my essay. He was looking at me. "Your father tells me you're a voracious reader," he began. It wasn't a question about history. It was a question about me. "I like to read," I confirmed quietly. "Good." "Readers live 1,000 lives, but in your own life, you seem hesitant to live. Why is that?" "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," he said, his voice soft, hypnotic. "I see it in class. You have this formidable mind, Lily, a mind that makes connections others don't see, but you keep it caged. You're afraid of it. Are you afraid of how powerful you are?" The question threw me off balance. He wasn't criticizing me. He was praising me in a way that made me feel flawed. He was a master of confusion. He was telling me I was strong, and my fear was just a symptom of that strength. It was a dizzying, intoxicating idea. He picked up my essay. "This paper," he said, tapping it with a finger, "on the Marshall Plan. It's well-researched, the writing is clear, but it's polite. It's the work of someone asking for permission to have an opinion." He looked up at me. "You don't need permission, Lily. Not from me, not from anyone." He was dismantling my father's philosophy piece by piece, but he was using my father's own goal, my success, to do it. He was positioning himself as my liberator. He spent the next hour talking, his voice a low, constant murmur. We spoke very little about history. We spoke about ideas, about philosophy, about the nature of power and influence. He shared a story about his own youth, a secret about how he was once painfully shy until a professor took him under his wing and taught him that confidence was a performance. "Between you and me, Lily," he'd said, "most of the powerful men in the world are just the best actors." He made me feel like an equal, a confidant. The fear in my chest began to loosen its grip, replaced by a strange, thrilling sense of importance. My father saw me as a project. Mr. Albright saw me as a person, or so I believed. The session was nearing its end. The sun was almost gone, and the classroom was bathed in a gloomy orange twilight. "You've done good work today," he said. "We've laid a foundation." He came to stand behind my chair, and I stiffened. He pointed to a sentence in my essay. "This line here," he said, his voice close to my ear. "It's good, but it could be stronger." More assertive. And then I felt it. The weight of his hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a pat. It was a placement. His hand settled there, his fingers pressing into the fabric of my blouse, into the muscle beneath. A wave of ice and fire shot through me. Time seemed to slow down, to stretch like taffy. I was acutely aware of the warmth of his palm, the slight pressure of each individual finger. 1 second passed. 2, 3. It was an eternity. Every instinct in my body screamed wrong, wrong, wrong. I flinched. It was a small, involuntary jerk, a spasmodic twitch of muscle trying to pull away. His hand was gone instantly. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. I waited for an apology, an explanation, anything. Instead, I heard him laugh. It was a light, airy sound, completely at odds with the violation I felt. "Just trying to get you to relax, Lily," he said, his voice full of amused charm. "You carry so much tension in your shoulders. You're like a tightly wound spring. We'll have to work on that." I opened my eyes. He had already moved away, back to his desk, gathering his things as if nothing had happened. He had turned my visceral, instinctive fear into a personal failing. I was the one who was too tense. I was the one with the problem. He didn't just lock the door to the classroom, he was locking the door to my own certainty. "Same time on Thursday?" he asked, his back to me. "Yes," I managed to choke out. He walked to the door and, with another casual movement, slid the bolt back. The sound of it unlocking was as jarring as the sound of it locking had been. He held the door open for me. "Have a good evening, Lily." I hurried past him, not daring to look at his face. I practically ran down the hallway, my bag banging against my leg. I burst out of the school's side door and into the cool night air, gulping it down like a drowning person. I replayed the moment with his hand on my shoulder again and again, trying to convince myself it was nothing. A friendly gesture. A teacher encouraging a student. But I couldn't shake the feeling of his fingers, the weight of his possession. When I walked into my house, the first thing I heard was my father's voice from the living room, cheerful and expansive. He was on the phone, likely with one of his business partners. No, she just got back," he was saying, and I froze in the entryway. "She's getting extra tutoring from the best teacher at the school, a man named Albright. A real go-getter. He's taken a special interest. Yes, we've been very fortunate." I stood there in the shadows of the foyer, listening to my father sing the praises of the man who had just branded my skin with his touch. And I knew, with a cold, hollow certainty, that I was utterly and completely alone. The cage was locked from the outside, too. Predators are patient. They are gardeners of a sort, tending to their victim's fear, watering it with secrets, fertilizing it with shame. Mr. Albright didn't devour me all at once. He consumed me bite by methodical bite, twice a week behind a locked door. The sessions fell into a horrifying rhythm, a ritual of psychological erosion. The lock on the door was the opening prayer. The academic talk was the sermon, a brief and hollow formality. The real work began after the books were pushed aside. The sessions grew longer. His questions became more personal, probing into my friendships, my feelings, my relationship with my parents. He created an imaginary wall between me and the rest of the world, positioning himself as the only one who truly understood me. "Your father means well, but he's a brute force," he would say, his voice full of false sympathy. "He doesn't understand a delicate instrument like your mind." He made me his co-conspirator against my own family. The touches became more frequent, less ambiguous. A hand on my back that lingered too long, his fingers tracing my spine as he leaned over to look at a paper. A hand on my arm to stop me as I was about to leave, his grip just a little too tight, his thumb stroking the inside of my wrist. Each time, he would watch my reaction with his sharp, analytical eyes. If I flinched, he would smile and call me a frightened little bird. If I froze, he would nod approvingly, as if I had passed some unspoken test. He was teaching me to endure, to accept, to be still. He convinced me that this was a special, mature relationship, a meeting of minds that no one else could possibly comprehend. "If you were to tell anyone," he said once, his voice a silken threat, "they wouldn't understand. They would ruin me, of course, but they would destroy you. They would call you a liar, or worse. And your father? Can you imagine his disappointment? It would break him." The threat of my father's disappointment was his sharpest and most effective tool. He wielded it with surgical precision. And so I kept the secrets. I carried them with me out of that classroom, heavy and foul-smelling, like dead things in my pockets. My mind, once a quiet, orderly library, had become a haunted house. The ghosts of his words, his touch, his smell, walked the halls, There was no room left for trigonometric functions or the poetry of Walt Whitman. The space had been occupied. I would sit in my other classes, staring at the blackboard, the teacher's voice a meaningless drone. The numbers in my math textbook would swim before my eyes, refusing to resolve into coherent equations. My essays for English class, once my pride, became clumsy, disjointed things. I was there in body, a quiet girl in the third row, but my mind was miles away, trapped in room 204, reliving the pressure of his hand, the sound of the lock clicking shut. The first casualty was a math test, Mrs. Gable handed them back at the end of class, her expression neutral. I saw the large red C at the top of my paper before she even placed it on my desk. It felt like a punch to the gut. A C. I had never received a C in my life. It was a foreign, shameful letter. I quickly flipped the paper over, my cheeks burning, as if the grade itself were radioactive and could contaminate the students sitting near me. I walked home in a state of cold panic. The 5 blocks from the school to my house felt like a walk to the gallows. I could hide it for a day, maybe 2, but my father always asked. He kept a ledger of my academic life in his head. The test paper felt heavy in my bag, a slab of stone that was dragging me down. He was in his study when I got home. It was his fortress of solitude, a room paneled in dark wood and smelling of old books and leather. His awards and diplomas hung on the wall, a shrine to his own success. He was sitting at his massive oak desk, reading a legal brief. He looked up when I hesitated in the doorway. "Lily," he said, his tone businesslike. "How was the math test?" The question was immediate, direct. There was no escape. "It was fine," I lied, my voice thin. He took off his reading glasses and set them down, his eyes narrowing. He knew me too well. He could smell a lie the way a wolf smells fear. "Let me see it." "I don't have it with me," I tried, my heart beginning to pound. "I left it in my locker." "Go back and get it," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'll wait." Defeated, I slowly unzipped my bag and pulled out the folded paper. I felt like I was handing him a confession of some terrible crime. I held it out to him, and he took it from my fingers without touching my skin. He unfolded it. I watched his eyes scan the page, his expression hardening from suspicion to a cold, controlled fury. He didn't look at my correct answers. He only saw the red circles, the final damning grade at the top. For a long moment, he was silent. He placed the paper down on his desk, aligning it perfectly with the edge of his leather blotter. Then he looked at me. "A C," he said, the words clipped, precise. "You got a C." "I didn't understand the material," I began. "Don't," he cut me off, his voice rising. "Don't you dare stand there and give me excuses. I have given you every opportunity, every advantage. I have paid for tutors in the past. I have facilitated the help of the best teacher in that entire school, a man who is generously donating his own time to help you, and this is how you repay me? With a C?" He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Do you have any idea how this makes me look?" "How it makes us look." He started to pace behind the desk, his movements sharp and agitated. "I sacrifice. I work 60 hours a week to give you and your mother this life, this house, this education. All I ask for in return is excellence, not even excellence, just competence. And you can't even manage that." He stopped pacing and slammed his hand down on the desk. The sound made me jump, a choked gasp escaping my lips. "Mr. Albright is wasting his time on you," he roared, his face turning a dark mottled red. "A man of his caliber, and you disrespect his efforts with this failure. What do you do all day?" Daydream? Stare out the window? Is this some kind of teenage rebellion? "Is that it? Are you trying to embarrass me?" He stood there, shouting about the man who was supposed to be my savior, never knowing he was praising the architect of my ruin. They were a perfect, horrifying machine. One broke me down, and the other punished me for being broken, and they both called it an act of care. I couldn't speak. What could I possibly say? The reason I failed my math test is because the man you admire so much makes my skin crawl and my mind go blank? The reason I can't concentrate is because I spend 2 afternoons a week in a locked room with him, praying he won't touch me again. To say it would be to burn down the entire world, my world, his world, my mother's fragile world, it was unthinkable. So I stood there and took it, my body rigid, my eyes fixed on a spot on the wall behind him. I felt strangely distant, as if I were floating near the ceiling, watching this scene unfold with a kind of detached curiosity. It was the only way to survive. His rage eventually burned itself out, leaving behind cold, hard ash. He sank back into his chair, his breathing heavy. "You're grounded," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "For 1 month. You will come home from school, you will do your tutoring, and you will study. No friends. No telephone calls. No trips to the library on Saturdays. You will sit in your room, and you will fix this." "Do you understand me?" "Yes, Father," I whispered. "Get out of my sight." I turned and fled. I closed the door to my room and leaned against it, my body trembling. He thought he was building a prison to force me to study. He didn't realize he was just reinforcing the walls of the cell Mr. Albright had already built around me. He was stripping away my last lines of defense, my few moments of normalcy, my one friendship with Grace. He was making his abuser's job easier. He was handing me over, bound and gagged, for another month. My father called it a period of focused study. I called it being buried alive. My bedroom became my world, its 4 walls pressing in on me, the silence a constant low hum of dread for the next session with Mr. Albright. The grounding was a masterpiece of accidental cruelty. It severed my last thin thread to the outside world, my friendship with Grace, and left me adrift in a house that had become enemy territory. Time lost its shape. It was measured only by the rising and setting of the sun outside my window, and the ticking clock that marked the agonizingly slow approach of my twice-weekly appointments with terror. The sessions themselves grew bolder. My silence, my inability to fight back, emboldened him. He saw my isolation as his victory. The psychological games were interwoven now with a more confident physical familiarity. He would stand so close behind me, I could feel the heat from his body. He would rest a hand on my chair, his knuckles brushing against my hair. He found excuses to touch my hand when I passed him a paper, his fingers cool and dry against my own clammy skin. Each touch was a spark of revulsion that left a scorch mark on my soul. I learned to dissociate, to send my mind away to a blank white room while my body sat there, still and compliant, enduring it. The effects began to carve themselves onto my body. Sleep offered no escape. It was a landscape of locked doors and long, dark hallways. I was plagued by a constant, gnawing anxiety that stole my appetite. My clothes began to hang on my frame, and dark, bruised-looking circles bloomed beneath my eyes. I saw a stranger in the mirror, a pale, haunted girl with eyes that looked 100 years old. Surely my mother saw it. A mother would have to be blind not to see her own daughter wasting away before her eyes. But my mother, Eleanor, had perfected a very particular kind of blindness. It was a willful, curated blindness, a shield she used to protect the fragile piece of her own existence. She would look at me and comment on the weather. She would see me pushing food around my plate and ask if I had remembered to dust the living room mantelpiece. Her denial was an active breathing thing, a third person in the room with us. But after 2 weeks of this living death, a sliver of desperation finally grew sharp enough to pierce my learned silence. It was a Saturday afternoon. My father was out, a rare golf game with a business associate. The house was quiet. I found my mother in the dining room, undertaking one of her favorite rituals, polishing the family silver. It was a task of endless repetitive motion, a way to make the past shine, to ignore the tarnish of the present. She sat at the head of the great mahogany table, a soft cloth in her hand, rubbing a fork with a focused, circular motion. I looked at my mother and saw a woman trapped in her own gilded cage. She was a prisoner, just like me, but she had grown to love her bars. She polished them, she kept them clean, and she would do anything to avoid rattling them. I stood in the doorway for a full minute, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I rehearsed the words, the simple, desperate plea. "This is it," I told myself. "This is your last chance." "Mom?" My voice was so small it was barely a sound. She looked up, her expression a mixture of mild surprise and annoyance at being interrupted. "Lily." "I thought you were studying." "I was," I said, taking a hesitant step into the room. I don't feel well." She scanned me with a quick, dismissive glance. "You look pale." "Maybe you're catching a cold. There's aspirin in the medicine cabinet." She turned her attention back to the fork in her hand, her thumb rubbing away an imaginary speck of dirt. She was already shutting me down, offering a simple solution to a simple problem so we could move on. "It's not that," I insisted, my voice trembling now. I feel sick. On Mondays and Thursdays. Before I have to go see Mr. Albright." I had said it. I had connected the sickness to him. I watched her, praying for a flicker of understanding, of concern, of maternal instinct. "See me," I begged silently. "Please, see what is happening to me." Her hand stopped moving. She placed the fork down on the velvet cloth with meticulous care, but she did not look at me. She stared at the silver, at her own distorted reflection in its polished surface. "I don't want to go anymore, Mom," I whispered, the words a torrent of shame and terror. "Please, don't make me go back." The silence stretched. It was a different kind of silence than my father's. It was a frantic, fearful silence. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her knuckles were white as she gripped the edge of the table. She was afraid, but her fear was not for me. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low, urgent hiss. She looked towards the front door as if my father might materialize out of thin air. "Don't be ridiculous, Lily." "I'm not," I sobbed, the tears I had held back for so long finally breaking free. "Please, Mom, I can't. Stop it," she snapped, her head whipping around to face me. Her eyes were wide with a terror that was entirely selfish. "Just stop it. Do you have any idea what you're saying? The trouble you could cause?" "Trouble?" I asked, bewildered. "Yes, trouble," she hissed. "Your father has gone to great lengths to arrange this. He is finally pleased with you. Mr. Albright is a respected man, a good man. You are making progress. Do not ruin this. Do not cause trouble, Lily." Her words were like stones, each one striking me, knocking the air from my lungs. She wasn't listening to my pain. She was listening for the sound of my father's car in the driveway. She was calculating the cost of my distress, and she had decided it was too high a price to pay. "Your father knows what's best," she said, her voice softening into a weak, pleading tone, as if trying to convince herself as much as me. "He only wants you to succeed. Just be a good girl. Just do as you're told." In that moment, the last flickering ember of hope I had been nurturing went out. It wasn't my father's overt cruelty that finally broke me that day. It was my mother's cowardice. He was the storm, loud and destructive, but she was the faulty foundation that let the entire house collapse. He was the abuser, but she was the one who held the door open for him and told me to be quiet and polite. I stared at her, at this woman who had given birth to me, who had bandaged my knees and sung me to sleep. And I saw a stranger. A terrified woman who would sacrifice her own child on the altar of a quiet life. I turned without another word and walked out of the room. The tears had stopped. I felt nothing but a vast, cold emptiness. I went back to my room and closed the door. The house was silent again. But I had my answer. There was no help to be found within these walls. There was no one to turn to. I was an island, and the water was rising all around me. The conversation with my mother had cauterized something inside me. The raw, open wound of hope had been seared shut, leaving behind only hard, dead scar tissue. I no longer looked for rescue from within the walls of my home. I understood that my parents were not my allies. They were the wardens of my prison, one cruel, one cowardly, both equally effective. My life narrowed to a single, grim objective: survival. Endure the sessions, endure the silence at home, fade into the background at school. Become a ghost. Ghosts, however, are not always as invisible as they hope to be. Friendship, in your youth, is a mirror. Your friend reflects the best version of yourself back at you, but when I looked at Grace, I no longer saw myself. I saw a ghost looking back at a girl who was still alive, and the contrast was unbearable. Grace was vibrant and sharp, her laughter loud in the school hallways, her mind quick with jokes and observations. She was everything I was not, and everything I used to be. I tried to avoid her. I ate my lunch in a quiet corner of the cafeteria, and I took the long way to my classes to avoid her locker. But Grace was not my mother. Grace's eyes were wide open. She cornered me on a Tuesday during lunch period. I was making my usual escape to the library when she fell into step beside me, her presence a jolt of unwelcome energy. "Hiding from me, Miller?" she asked, her tone light, but her eyes were serious. "No, just have to study for a chem quiz," I lied, clutching my books to my chest like a shield. "Right," she said, unconvinced. "I'll come with you." I need to look up something for my English paper anyway. There was no way to refuse without a scene. We walked into the library, the familiar scent of old paper and quiet industry wrapping around us. It was a place that had once been my sanctuary, but now, like every other part of my life, it felt tainted. Grace led the way, not to the busy tables near the front, but deep into the stacks, to a secluded, dusty corner where the history books were kept. The irony was not lost on me. We were surrounded by the silent, bound stories of past tragedies. She stopped in a narrow aisle between shelves of Civil War chronicles and biographies of long-dead presidents. She didn't pretend to look for a book. She turned to face me, her back to the aisle, effectively blocking my escape. "Okay, Lily," she said, her voice a low, serious murmur. "Talk to me. What is going on?" "Nothing," I said automatically, my gaze darting around anywhere but at her face. "I'm just stressed about my grades. My dad's been on my case." It was a partial truth, the safest kind of lie. "Don't," she said, her voice sharp with impatience. "Don't lie to me. I'm not your father. This isn't about grades." She took a small step closer, and her eyes scanned my face with a look of intense, painful concern. "You look awful. You look like you haven't really slept in a month. You're jumpy all the time, and you've lost so much weight I can see the bones in your wrist." She paused, then her voice dropped even lower. "I saw the marks on your arm last week when you dropped your books. They looked like fingerprints." My blood ran cold. I instinctively pulled the sleeve of my sweater down over my wrist, a gesture of pure, incriminating guilt. She saw the movement, and her expression, already filled with worry, hardened into a terrible certainty. "It's him, isn't it?" she whispered, her eyes blazing with a protective fury. "It's Albright." "It's those tutoring sessions." She was offering me a hand to pull me from the water. All I had to do was take it. All I had to do was nod, to whisper yes, and the terrible burden of the secret would be shared. For a single, agonizing second, the word hovered on my lips. I could feel it, a physical presence in my throat, the urge to collapse, to confess, to let this strong, loyal friend hold me and tell me it would be okay, was overwhelming. My whole body yearned for it, but the monster in the deep had convinced me that the surface was even more dangerous than the drowning. A flood of images, of Albright's warnings, filled my mind, his cold smile, the threat in his voice. "They would destroy you. They would call you a liar, your father." Can you imagine his disappointment? To speak the truth would be to unleash a tsunami that would destroy everyone, including the one person trying to save me. I would be the source of the trouble my mother so feared. I would be the cause of my father's ultimate shame. And what would Grace do? Tell her parents? Tell a teacher? It would lead to a war I was not equipped to fight. Fear won. It always won. "This isn't you, Lily," Grace pleaded, her voice cracking with emotion. "What is he doing to you in there?" The directness of the question shattered my paralysis. Panic, cold and absolute, took over. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, the words coming out in a rushed, defensive torrent. "He's helping me. Mr. Albright is a great teacher. My history grade is an A now. My father is finally happy." "You're imagining things." The lies tasted like acid on my tongue. Grace stared at me, her face a mask of disbelief and hurt. "An A." "Lily, I don't care if you have an A+ in every class. Look at yourself. Is it worth this?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't look at her. I couldn't stand the clear, honest love in her eyes, because it only illuminated my own cowardice. I pushed past her, my shoulder bumping hers. I have to go, I mumbled, and I fled. Running from Grace was the most violent thing I had ever done. It was an act of self-mutilation. I was severing my own limb to save the rest of the poisoned body. I didn't look back as I hurried out of the library, but I could feel her eyes on my back. I left her standing there in the silence among the stories of the dead, and in doing so, I sealed the final door on the outside world. From now on, the only voices I would hear were the ones inside my own head, and the one that waited for me, twice a week, in room 204. The world outside my window thawed, but I remained frozen. Autumn's fire had given way to the hard, white silence of winter, which in turn was now surrendering to the muddy, reluctant green of a Vermont spring. The seasons changed, but my life did not. It was a flat, gray landscape of dread, punctuated twice a week by the sharp peaks of terror in room 204. My rejection of Grace had been the final turning of a key in a lock I didn't know I was building around myself. I was an automaton, moving through the motions of being a student, a daughter. I did my homework. I sat silently at dinner. I endured. Then came the sickness. At first it was easy to dismiss, a wave of dizziness in chemistry class that I blamed on the Bunsen burner fumes. A strange, metallic taste in my mouth that I tried to rinse away with water. But then it grew more insistent. It started ambushing me in the mornings, a lurching in my stomach that would send me running to the bathroom, my body convulsing with violent, empty heaves. The smell of my mother frying bacon in the kitchen, a scent that had once been a comforting part of my childhood, now made me gag. My mother noticed, of course. "You've got that stomach bug that's been going around," she declared one morning, her back to me as she stood at the stove. It was another one of her easy diagnoses, another way to label and file away a problem she did not want to inspect too closely. But I knew it wasn't a bug. My body, which I had tried so hard to disconnect from, to treat as a separate entity that simply had to endure things, had now become my greatest betrayer. It had kept a secret I wasn't aware of. It had been silently, horrifyingly, keeping score. A girl's body has its own rhythms, its own calendar. Mine had fallen silent. There had been no cycle last month, nor the month before. I had told myself it was stress, the grounding, the pressure, my father's rage. But as I knelt on the cold tile of the bathroom floor, my forehead pressed against the cool porcelain of the toilet bowl, I connected the silence in my body with the new, violent sickness. The thought, when it first appeared, was so monstrous that I recoiled from it. Impossible. It was a word from a different world, a thing that happened to other girls, foolish girls, girls in cautionary tales. It could not happen to me, but the thought was a tenacious seed. It planted itself in the back of my mind and began to sprout, its roots twisting around my insides, choking me. Impossible, but what if? The not knowing became a torture worse than the sickness itself. I had to know. I was 16 years old, and I was undertaking the most important journey of my life, completely alone. I couldn't tell my mother, I couldn't tell my father, and I had chased away the only friend who might have held my hand. There was no one in the entire world to turn to. I began saving my lunch money. Each day I would claim I wasn't hungry, pocketing the dollar bills my father left on the kitchen counter. It took 2 weeks to save enough. The following Saturday I told my parents I was going to the town library to work on a research paper. Instead, I walked to the bus station on the edge of town and bought a round-trip ticket to Rutland, a larger town 20 miles away where no one would know my face. The bus ride was a blur of green hills and mounting panic. I felt like a criminal, a fugitive from my own life. The pharmacy in Rutland was bright, clean, and filled with strangers. I walked the aisles for 15 minutes, my heart pounding, before I finally found the small, discreet boxes. I grabbed one without looking at the brand, carried it to the counter, and paid the cashier with a handful of crumpled, sweaty bills. Her expression was bored, indifferent. To her, I was just another anonymous purchase. To me, this small cardboard box held the verdict on my entire existence. I couldn't take it on the bus. I couldn't take it home. I needed an answer now. A block from the pharmacy, I saw a gas station with a sign for a public restroom. It was my only option. The bathroom was on the side of the building. the key attached to a greasy wooden block. The room was small and filthy. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and chemical disinfectant. A single fluorescent bulb flickered overhead, casting a sickly, buzzing light on the grimy sink and cracked toilet. It was a place for secrets and despair. It was the perfect place. I locked the flimsy door and leaned against it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely open the box. The instructions on the leaflet blurred before my eyes. I followed the steps like a robot, my mind numb. Then came the wait. 3 minutes. It was the longest 3 minutes of my life. I sat on the edge of the dirty toilet seat, my eyes fixed on the small plastic stick I had placed on the stained sink counter. It was a talisman that could either grant me a reprieve or condemn me to hell. Please no, I chanted in my head, a frantic, silent prayer. Please, please, please no. Time was up. With a trembling hand, I picked up the stick. I stared at the small window. In the flickering, unsteady light, I saw it, not a word, just a symbol. A simple, stark blue line forming a cross with another. A positive sign. An answer. A death sentence. The air left my lungs in a single ragged gasp. The plastic stick slipped from my nerveless fingers and clattered onto the dirty floor. My legs gave out from under me, and I slid down the wall, my body folding in on itself. I landed on the cold, sticky linoleum, the grime of the floor soaking through the knee of my jeans. I was 16 years old, in a gas station bathroom in a town where no one knew my name, and my life was over. There are 2 moments that define a woman's life: the day she is born, and the day she discovers she is carrying a life herself. For me, they were one and the same. The day I learned I was pregnant was the day the girl I was, the quiet, studious girl who just wanted her father's approval, truly died. In her place was a terrified stranger, a vessel for a secret that would destroy everything it touched. The sickness had a name now. It was not a flu, not a virus. It was a life that would be both my punishment and, though I could not possibly know it then, my only salvation. A secret, when it is new, is a small, hard stone you can hide in your pocket. But a secret like mine grows. It becomes a living thing with its own weight, its own heartbeat, and eventually it grows too large to be contained. It demands to be born into the world, no matter how much fire and ruin its birth will cause. By late spring, my body was no longer my own. The sickness of the early weeks had subsided, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness and a subtle but undeniable thickening around my waist. I wore baggy sweaters and layered my clothes, but it was a desperate, temporary measure. The secret was pushing its way into the visible world. I was living on borrowed time. The tutoring sessions with Mr. Albright had become a surreal torture. He knew. I don't know how, but he knew. There was a new look in his eyes when he looked at me, a smug, proprietary satisfaction. He had planted his flag. The territory was his. The breaking point came, as all our family tragedies did, at the dinner table. The room was, as always, a stage set for a play about a happy, successful family. My father was discussing a recent victory in a legal case, his voice confident and self-congratulatory. My mother was listening with a look of practiced adoration. I was pushing a piece of chicken around my plate, the smell of roasted rosemary making my stomach churn. A wave of nausea, stronger than any I had felt in weeks, rose up from my gut. It was hot and acidic. I pressed my napkin to my lips, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. "Lily, are you even listening?" My father's voice cut through my haze. "I asked you a question." I hadn't heard him. I could only hear the rushing sound in my own ears. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, my eyes wide. "I don't feel well." I threw my napkin down and pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. I ran from the room, my hand clamped over my mouth, and barely made it to the small powder room off the foyer before my body was seized by violent, retching spasms. When it was over, I was left kneeling on the floor, trembling and weak. I heard footsteps approaching. The door opened. My father stood there, his face a thundercloud of fury. Behind him, my mother hovered, her face pale and worried. "What is the meaning of this?" my father demanded. "This is the 3rd time this month you have caused a scene. "What is wrong with you?" He wasn't asking out of concern. He was accusing me of a breach of protocol. I had no strength left to lie. The secret was too heavy. I looked up at him from the floor, my eyes filled with a despair so absolute it left no room for fear. "I'm pregnant." The words fell into the silence of the hallway. They seemed to hang in the air, small and yet powerful enough to suck all the oxygen from the space. My mother made a sound, a choked little gasp, and her hand flew to her mouth. My father's face went slack with shock, then flushed with a deep crimson rage, his fists clenched at his sides. This was it. This was the hurricane I had been expecting. "Get up," he said, his voice a low, guttural growl. "Get up and come into the living room. Now." I pulled myself to my feet, using the wall for support. I felt strangely calm, disembodied. I followed them into the living room, the site of all our formal, unhappy family announcements. I sat on the edge of an armchair. My mother sank into the sofa and immediately began to weep, her shoulders shaking in silent, convulsive sobs. My father began to pace, a caged tiger, his fury radiating from him in waves. I had prepared myself for this. I had braced for the insults, the condemnation, the slamming doors. I was not prepared for what came next. After several long, tense minutes of pacing, my father stopped. The rage seemed to drain out of him, replaced by something far more terrifying: stillness. He sat down heavily in the armchair opposite me. He looked at me, his eyes cold and clear. It was not the look of a furious father. It was the look of a man assessing a disastrous business complication. "Who?" he asked, the single word sharp and hard as a diamond. "You know who," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "There's only been one person." "Mr. Albright." I said the name and braced for the final explosion. I expected him to leap from his chair, to curse the man who had violated his home and his daughter. Instead, a look of profound, weary resignation settled over his features. He leaned back in his chair and covered his face with his hands for a moment, letting out a long, slow sigh. When he looked at me again, the last vestiges of paternal anger were gone, replaced by a chilling, pragmatic calm. The world did not tilt. It shattered. The floor fell away, and I was suspended in a black, silent void. "I had a business partner, years ago," my father began, his voice low and steady, as if he were dictating a memo. "Albright's father. We invested in a property development deal. I put up everything I had. The deal went south. It was a catastrophe. I was ruined, worse than ruined. I owed his family a fortune. A sum I could never hope to repay in 100 lifetimes." He paused, looking at his hands. "They could have destroyed me, bankrupted me, destroyed my reputation in this town forever. But they were patient. Then last year, David Albright came to me. His father had passed away, and he held the debt. He told me he admired our family. He said he saw great potential in you." I stared at him, my mind refusing to assemble the pieces. It was impossible. "He said he was willing to forgive the entire debt," my father continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "He said all he wanted in return was to be a friend to the family, to mentor you. He saw it as his way of ensuring the next generation of Millers had a chance to succeed, unburdened by my mistakes." My father's words were not the confession of a monster. They were the calm, rational points of a business negotiation. He had not sold his soul. He had sold mine. And he was now explaining the terms of the sale. I looked over at my mother, who was still weeping, her face buried in a cushion, and I finally understood her fear, her silence, her constant, frantic polishing of a life that was already rotten to the core. Her tears were not for me. She was not shocked by this revelation. She was the bookkeeper of my father's monstrous transaction. She knew the price of our life, and she knew that I was the one paying it. "Your grades," my father said, his gaze locking onto mine. "You're B+. I wasn't angry about the grade, Lily. I was terrified that you weren't holding up your end of the bargain, that your attitude would offend him, that he would change his mind and call in the debt." The breath I was holding escaped me in a shudder. The fury, the lectures, the disappointment, it was all a lie. It was fear. fear that his asset was proving defective. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression one of hard, grim necessity. "So you see," he said, his voice dropping lower. "This changes things, but it does not change the fundamental reality of our situation. You think this is about you? About your feelings? A teenage mistake? It is not. This is about the survival of this family. The survival of our name, our home, everything I have worked to build." He stood up and looked down at me, a girl of 16, pregnant with her abuser's child, a child he had knowingly sold to a predator. "You will not ruin this family, Lily," he said, his voice cold as the grave. "You will do what is necessary to protect it." He called it survival. He called it protecting the family name, but I knew what it was. It was a deal with the devil. And I was the price. In the aftermath of the revelation, our house became a mausoleum. The silence was no longer heavy with unspoken tension. It was thin and sharp, the sound of glass threatening to shatter. My father's chilling calm was a permanent fixture, the calm of a general whose battle plans had gone horribly wrong but who refused to concede defeat. My mother drifted through the rooms like a wraith, her eyes red-rimmed and perpetually fixed on the middle distance. We were three strangers sharing a space, bound not by love, but by the ugly, unassailable truth of the bargain my father had struck. I was no longer a daughter. I was a scandal, a liability. A breach of contract, and my exile was the penalty clause. The decision was delivered to me a week later in my father's study. It was not a discussion. It was a decree. "You will be leaving at the end of the week," he announced, not looking up from a set of papers on his desk. "Your mother has found a suitable place in Maine. A private Catholic home for young women in your condition. They are equipped to handle the situation with discretion." The situation. That's what I was. That's what the life inside me was. "We will tell people you have gone to care for your great-aunt Martha. Her emphysema is acting up again. It's a plausible, respectable story." He finally looked at me, his eyes as cold and impersonal as a banker's. "The arrangements are made. The tuition is paid. You will pack one suitcase, practical items only. You will not cause any trouble." The next day, I heard my mother on the phone with her sister, my aunt. Her voice was a masterpiece of feigned concern, warm and syrupy. "Oh, it's just terrible, Carol," she sighed into the receiver. "Poor Aunt Martha can hardly catch her breath." Richard and I felt it was Lily's duty to go and help. She's such a good girl, so caring. Of course, she'll have to withdraw from school for the semester, but family comes first, you know. I stood in the upstairs hallway, listening to my own erasure. My mother was such a convincing liar. She spoke of a fictional, caring daughter, while the real one, the one who was being shipped away in shame, stood 20 feet away, her heart turning to stone. The morning of my departure was gray and damp, the sky the color of slate. The car ride to Maine was a 5-hour funeral procession. My father drove, his eyes fixed on the road, his jaw set. My mother sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. I sat in the back, a prisoner in the dock. Not a single word was spoken. The silence in the car was the purest silence I have ever known. It was the sound of a family that had finally, completely run out of lies to tell itself. All that was left was the cold, hard truth of the transaction and the quiet hum of the engine carrying me away from everything I had ever known. St. Jude's Haven for Wayward Girls was a grim granite fortress perched on a windswept hill overlooking a gray, churning sea. It looked less like a haven and more like a prison. We were met at the heavy oak door by a woman named Sister Agnes. She was tall and thin, her face a roadmap of disapproving lines, her black habit as stark and unforgiving as the building itself. The handover was swift and transactional. My father gave the sister an envelope, likely the final payment. He turned to me, his duty done. "Do as you are told," he said, his voice low. It was not a piece of fatherly advice. It was the final command to his asset. My mother wouldn't look at me. She just stared at a crack in the stone floor, her face a mask of miserable self-pity. Then they turned and walked away, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous entryway. The great oak door closed behind them with a deep, final thud. I was alone. They took my name, they took my clothes, they took my past. The intake was a process of systematic dehumanization. A stern, silent nun went through my suitcase, confiscating a small book of poetry and a photograph of Grace I had hidden in the lining. "Vanities," she sniffed, tossing them into a box. I was given a uniform, a shapeless gray dress of coarse, scratchy wool. In the eyes of the sisters at St. Jude's, I was not Lily Miller from Maple Creek, Vermont. I was a vessel of shame, a fallen woman, another body to be hidden away until the evidence of my sin could be disposed of. Life became a monotonous gray loop. We were 20 girls, all with the same haunted, hollowed-out eyes. We rose before dawn for prayers. We spent our days in silent, hard labor, scrubbing floors, washing mountains of laundry in steaming, caustic vats, tending a windswept vegetable garden where nothing seemed to grow. Our meals were silent. Our evenings spent darning socks under the watchful eye of a nun who would rap our knuckles with a ruler if our stitches were uneven. We were ghosts, drifting past each other in the hallways, too submerged in our own misery to connect. We were all carrying the same secret, and it made us strangers to one another. Once a month, a letter would arrive from my mother. My heart would leap with a pathetic, stubborn flicker of hope, and every time, that hope would be crushed. Her letters were masterpieces of evasion. They were filled with the weather in Maple Creek, the goings-on of neighbors I no longer knew, and endless passive-aggressive instructions. "We trust you are behaving yourself and following the sisters' rules. Your father closed the Henderson account last week, which was a great relief. Never once did she ask, 'Are you okay?' Never once did she write, 'I miss you.' Never once did she write, 'I love you.' The letters were not for me. They were for her, proof that she was still performing the duty of a mother, fulfilling her end of the bargain from a safe and sterile distance. I was in exile, erased, forgotten. I would lie on my thin, lumpy mattress in the cold, damp dormitory, listening to the lonely cry of the gulls and the distant roar of the ocean. I would place a hand on my swelling abdomen, the only part of my life that felt real. They had made one critical miscalculation. They thought they had buried me deep in the frozen ground of this forgotten place. They didn't realize that even in the coldest, darkest earth, a seed can still find a way to grow. And in the absolute silence of my despair, a tiny, fluttering movement inside me began to whisper a promise, a reason to survive. The months at St. Jude's bled into one another, a watercolor wash of gray sea, gray sky, and gray wool. The other girls remained specters, their faces pale and interchangeable, their bellies swelling in unison with mine. We were a silent, sorrowful sorority. Occasionally, one of us would disappear in the night to the sterile infirmary wing and return a day or two later, hollow-eyed and empty-armed, her brief, tragic motherhood already a thing of the past. The babies were ghosts, too. We never saw them. They were whisked away in the dark, destined for good Catholic homes, their existence erased before it had even begun. I watched this grim cycle and knew my time was coming. I stopped thinking of my father, of my mother, of Mr. Albright. They belonged to a different world, a life that no longer felt like my own. My entire universe had contracted to the burgeoning life inside me. He was my anchor in the gray emptiness. I would lie awake in the dormitory, listening to the wind howl off the Atlantic and feel the gentle flutter of his movements. It was a secret language, a conversation only the two of us could have. In a place designed to strip me of everything, he was the one thing they could not touch. He was mine. I decided to name him Daniel. It was a strong, clean name, a name I chose. It was my first act of defiance. Labor, when it came, was a crucible. It arrived in the dead of a cold autumn night, a sharp, insistent clenching deep in my back. It burned away everything that was not essential. For 12 hours, in a stark white room that smelled of bleach and fear, I was not Lily Miller. I was not my father's daughter. I was not a fallen woman. I was a force of nature, an animal body doing the only thing it was made to do. A stern-faced nun read prayers in a monotone, but I did not hear her. The pain was a roaring ocean, and I let it carry me. And in its fiery, purifying violence, I was, for the first time, free. Then, silence. And a small, thin cry that cut through the sterile air and stitched my shattered soul back together. The world tells you that a child born of violence is a child of shame. The world is wrong. The moment they placed him in my arms, the act of his creation was erased. He was not a consequence. He was a beginning. He was perfect. He had a dusting of dark hair and a tiny Cupid's bow mouth. His eyes, when they opened, were a deep, fathomless blue. He was mine. He was the only thing in my life that had not been tainted by my father's ambition or my abuser's touch. I named him Daniel, whispering it against his soft, warm scalp. And when I did, he quieted, as if he recognized his name, as if he recognized me. I was allowed one day with him. One perfect, 24-hour eternity. The next afternoon, Sister Agnes came to my bedside. She stood over me, a tall, black-clad pillar of righteousness. "The arrangements have been made," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "A good family in Boston, a lawyer and his wife. They cannot have children of their own. He will have a good life." She spoke of him as if he were a parcel to be delivered, a problem to be solved. "You will not be seeing him again," she continued. "It is better this way." A clean break. The most charitable thing you can do now, for him and for yourself, is to forget. Put this behind you. Go home and begin your life anew. They underestimated the ferocity of a love born in darkness. They thought they could command a heart to forget. That night, I could not sleep. The emptiness of my arms was a physical ache, a phantom limb that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The dormitory was quiet, filled with the soft sighs and troubled sleep murmurs of the other girls. I slipped out of my bed, my bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. I crept down the dark hallway to the nursery, a room I was forbidden to enter. The door was unlocked. Inside, a dozen bassinets were lined up like tiny white coffins. A sliver of moonlight from a high window cut across the floor. I found him instantly. Daniel. I lifted him from the bassinet, his small, warm weight a balm against my aching heart. He smelled of milk and innocence. I held him close, his face nestled in the crook of my neck, and looked out the window at the sliver of moon in the black, unforgiving sky. And there, in the absolute darkness, with my son in my arms for what I believed would be the last time, I made a vow. It was not a prayer whispered to a God I no longer trusted. It was a promise, forged in the coldest, hardest part of my soul. "I will not let this place break me," I promised him silently, my tears falling onto his blanket. "I will not become one of the ghosts who haunts these halls. I will survive. They think they can take you from me. They are wrong. You are my son. I will find you. I don't know how, but I will get you back. I will spend the rest of my life looking for you if I have to. And I will live to see the day when the men who did this to us, my father, who sold me, and the man who gave you his blood but not his name, will answer for it. I do not know how. I do not know when. But they will. I will be patient. I will be quiet. And I will wait. I swear this on my life. I swear this on yours." A profound, cold clarity settled over me. The fear did not vanish, but it was no longer my master. It was now just a tool, a whetstone on which I would sharpen my new and singular purpose. The next morning, when Sister Agnes and a younger, sad-eyed nun came to take him away, I did not cry. I did not plead. I swaddled him carefully in his blanket, kissed his forehead one last time, and handed him over. I let them see a face as still and cold as the granite walls of that place. They thought they saw submission, a broken girl's final surrender. They were wrong. They were seeing the birth of a patience that could outlast stone. They had taken my son, but they had left me with a reason to live. They had given me a weapon. A promise, a vow made in darkness can either be consumed by the shadows or become a light of its own. My promise to Daniel became my northern star. It did not make the path easy, but it made it navigable. They gave me a bus ticket and $20 when I left St. Jude's. My body was an empty, aching vessel, but my mind was sharp and clear for the first time in years. They thought they were casting me out. In reality, they were setting me free. I did not go home to Maple Creek. Home was a place that no longer existed. I got off the bus in Boston, a city where I was anonymous, a place where no one knew my name or my shame. I became a ghost, drifting through the city's veins. I found a tiny room in a boarding house and a job waitressing at a 24-hour diner, the kind of place that smells of stale coffee and desperation. I worked until my feet swelled and my back ached, and I saved every dollar I could. I was no longer a victim enduring. I was a survivor with a mission. Patience is a weapon forged in powerlessness. The world is built of walls and rules designed to keep people like me out, to keep secrets like my son buried forever. But a mother searching for her child is a force of nature to which rules do not apply. The search for Daniel was the work of years. I started with the Catholic Charities in Boston, the agency Sister Agnes had mentioned. I was met with polite, unyielding stone walls. Records were sealed, they said. It was for the child's own good, they said. It was the law. So I worked outside the law. I spent my nights in the public library, learning about the system. I wrote letters until my fingers were cramped. I made phone calls until my voice was hoarse. I became a polite, persistent nuisance. And finally, after 3 years of dead ends and closed doors, I found a crack in the wall. Her name was Mrs. Peterson, a social worker on the verge of retirement. She was a woman with tired eyes who had seen enough of the world's quiet cruelties to recognize one more. I told her my story. Not all of it, never all of it, but enough. She saw the unwavering fire in my eyes, and for reasons I will never know, she chose to help. She bent a rule. She made a phone call she wasn't supposed to make. She found him. His new name was Michael. He lived with a lawyer and his wife in a handsome brick house in Brookline. He was 4 years old. Mrs. Peterson arranged a chance meeting at a public park. I watched from a bench as he played on the swings, a beautiful, laughing boy with my eyes and a stranger's name. The sight of him, healthy and happy, both healed me and broke my heart all over again. The fight to get him back was another war, fought in courtrooms and lawyers' offices. His adoptive parents were powerful and well-connected. I was a single woman with a menial job and a fabricated past, but I had something they didn't, a truth so fierce it was incandescent. With Mrs. Peterson's quiet guidance, I fought. I proved I was his biological mother. I proved I was stable and capable, and after a year that cost me every dollar I had saved and every ounce of strength I possessed, I won. I walked out of a courthouse with my son's small hand in mine. He was Daniel again. We built a life together, far from the shadows of Maple Creek. It was a life of small apartments and second-hand clothes, but it was rich with love. I worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses during the day and waitressing at night, so that he would never want for anything essential. I filled our home with books, fostering his bright, inquisitive mind. I watched him grow into a kind, gentle, and brilliant young man, the very antithesis of the men who had created him. He was the living, breathing fulfillment of the first half of my vow. The second half waited. It was a cold, patient thing, sleeping in a quiet corner of my heart. The news of my parents' deaths came years later, after Daniel was already in college. I saw the obituaries online. Richard Miller, respected attorney, pillar of his community, dead of a heart attack at 68. Eleanor Miller, beloved wife, passed away peacefully in her sleep 6 months later, as if his absence had finally allowed her to let go. The words were a fiction, the final lie printed for all to see. I did not feel grief. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt quiet, the feeling of a great weight being lifted. The wardens were gone. The final chains had fallen away. It was time. Decades after I had been driven out in a silent car, I drove myself back to Maple Creek. The town had changed, but not as much as I had. New storefronts dotted Main Street, but the library was still there, a fortress of old brick. The high school, with its familiar clock tower, still loomed on the hill. I was Mrs. Lily Martin now, a quiet widow, recently retired. My son, a successful university professor, lived on the West Coast, and I was looking for a peaceful place to spend my later years. My story was simple, plausible, and utterly boring. A ghost has an advantage. People look right through you. They see what they expect to see. A harmless old woman, her hair the color of snow, her movements slow and deliberate. They don't see the girl who left in shame. They don't see the vow she carries in her heart. They certainly don't see the reckoning she has come home to deliver. I bought a small cottage on the edge of town. It was unremarkable, easily overlooked, but it had a clear view of the road leading to the high school. I spent the first few weeks putting the house in order, planting a small garden, and reintroducing myself to the rhythms of the town I had once called home. I was a quiet observer, a ghost settling back into her haunting grounds. I listened at the post office. I read the local paper. I watched. I remembered, and I waited. The second half of my vow had been dormant for a very long time. It was time to wake it up. Patience, I learned, is not a passive waiting. It is an active, watchful stillness. For 2 years, I lived in my small cottage, a quiet widow tending her garden. I became a part of Maple Creek's scenery, as unremarkable as the old oak tree in the town square. I joined the library's book club. I made polite small talk at the grocery store, and I listened. I gathered the threads of the town's memory, piecing together the narrative of the last 30 years. And I learned about the man David Albright had become. He was a local legend, a beloved educator who had retired a decade ago after a celebrated 40-year career. There was an annual scholarship in his name at the high school. His portrait, handsome and smiling, hung in the main lobby. I saw an article in the Maple Creek Chronicle celebrating his 78th birthday, lauding him as a man who had shaped generations of young minds. The irony was a physical sickness in my stomach. He had shaped me, that was certain. The time had come. My revenge was not to be a fire, a wild and cleansing blaze. I had no interest in fire. Fire burns out, leaving only ash. I had cultivated something far more permanent. My revenge was a glacier, slow, silent, unstoppable, and it was about to carve a new legacy into the landscape of this town. I found his number in the phone book and called him on a Tuesday morning. My voice was steady, disguised by age, a little shaky, perfect for the role I was about to play. I told him my name was Mrs. Martin, and that my late husband had been one of his students long ago and had always spoken of him as the finest teacher he'd ever had. I said I was new in town and would be honored if I could visit him for a few minutes to share some memories. He was, as I expected, utterly charming and magnanimous. He invited me to his home for tea the following afternoon. His house was on a quiet, tree-lined street, a handsome colonial with dark green shutters. It was the very picture of respectable retirement. He met me at the door himself, leaning on a carved wooden cane. He was smaller than I remembered, his frame stooped with age, but his eyes still held that familiar, intelligent glimmer. He did not recognize me at all. He led me into a living room filled with books, photographs of smiling children and grandchildren, and plaques of recognition from the town. It was the carefully constructed museum of a good and successful life. He served me tea in a delicate china cup. "So," he said, settling into a plush armchair opposite me, his smile gracious. "Your husband, what was his name?" I'm afraid my memory isn't what it once was. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, placing the cup back on its saucer with a soft clink. I looked him directly in the eye. "My husband's name is not important," I said, my voice quiet, the feigned shakiness gone, replaced by a flat, calm tone. "But my name is. It's Lily Miller." I watched him. His polite smile faltered. A flicker of confusion crossed his face as he searched the archives of his memory. The name clearly meant nothing to him. He had known so many girls. "I'm sorry," he began. "I don't seem to—" "You don't remember me, David," I interrupted softly. "But I remember you." "I remember everything." I leaned forward just slightly. "I remember room 204. It was as if I had thrown a switch. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty gray pallor. The gracious host vanished, replaced by a frightened old man. His hand trembled where it rested on his cane. He finally saw me. Not the old woman with white hair, but the ghost of a 16-year-old girl sitting in his living room. I I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, the old manipulative instincts kicking in. You must be mistaken. No, I said, my voice still quiet, still calm. There is no mistake. I looked at the frail old man in the armchair, and for a fleeting moment, I almost felt pity. But I quickly reminded myself that a predator's age does not lessen his crimes. It only means he has had more time to forget them. My purpose was not to punish the old man he had become, but to unearth the monster he had always been. I'm not here for money, David, I continued, preempting his next thought. And I'm not here to cause a scene. I am long past screaming. He stared at me, bewildered, his mind racing to understand the nature of the threat. I have a son, I said. His name is Daniel. He's a professor of American history at Stanford University. A brilliant man. I'm very proud of him. I let that hang in the air for a moment. He's just finished co-authoring a book, I went on. It's being published next spring by the University Press. It's called The Hidden Histories of Maple Creek: Power, Secrets, and Silence in a Small New England Town. He was beginning to understand. I could see a new kind of terror dawning in his eyes, a terror far deeper than the fear of a simple scandal. It's an academic work, I explained, meticulously researched, peer-reviewed. It explores the stories that hide behind the town's pristine facade, the unacknowledged truths, and Daniel, being a good historian, insisted on including a chapter about the school system. He expected a scream. I gave him a bibliography. He expected a lawsuit. I gave him a university press. He had built his life on whispers and secrets and the power to silence young girls. I was about to entomb him in the one thing from which he could never escape, a well-documented, peer-reviewed, and permanently published truth. It turns out, I said, my voice dropping almost to a whisper, that I wasn't the only special student you took an interest in over the years. I found others, David. I found Sarah from the class before mine. And Elizabeth, from 5 years after. Their stories, when placed alongside my own, form a very clear, very disturbing pattern. He looked like he couldn't breathe. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. This book, I said, delivering the final, killing blow, has a chapter dedicated to that pattern, to you. Your name will be remembered in this town forever. Your scholarship, your portrait in the hall, they will all be footnotes to the truth of what you were. Your legacy won't be teaching, it will be this. I stood up, my visit concluded. He remained frozen in his chair, a statue of horror, surrounded by the meaningless trophies of his life. I had not laid a hand on him. I had not raised my voice. But I had done something far more brutal. I had taken his story away from him and replaced it with the truth, and the truth would be his only eulogy. Thank you for the tea, David, I said, placing my napkin on the table. I walked out of his house and into the bright afternoon sun, leaving him there, a king in a castle whose walls had just been replaced with glass. The glacier had arrived. My conversation with David Albright was like dropping a stone into a deep, still well. I could not see the bottom, but I knew the ripples would eventually reach every edge. In the week that followed, I went about my quiet life. I weeded my garden. I returned my books to the library. On the surface, nothing had changed. But when I drove past his handsome colonial house, I noticed the curtains were always drawn, the porch light was never on. A fortress of respectable retirement had become a tomb. I did not know it at the time, of course, but while I was tending the first of my spring roses, a final act in a tragedy written decades ago was playing out across town. A ghost I had long since buried was about to make his final, pathetic curtain call. A lawyer, a man Albright didn't know, called him on a Thursday. The call was brief and formal, a safety deposit box held in trust as part of the estate of the late Richard P. Miller had been unsealed. The conditions of the will had been met. There was an item inside for Mr. Albright to collect. The lawyer mentioned, as a matter of clerical procedure, that the triggering event for the box's opening was Mr. Albright's 78th birthday, which had been the week before. The same week I had come to visit. A coincidence of cruel, cosmic timing, or perhaps one last, meticulously planned act of psychological torment from my father. I imagine Albright's journey to the lawyer's office was that of a condemned man walking his last mile. Every passing car, every glance from a stranger on the street must have felt like a precursor to the public disgrace he was now certain was coming. He was given a single large manila envelope, surprisingly heavy for its size. His name was written on the front in my father's familiar, arrogant script. He would have waited until he was back within the stale, suffocating air of his own home before opening it. He would have sat in that same armchair, the one opposite the chair I had occupied, the envelope resting on his knees. His hands, already trembling with age and new fear, would have struggled with the clasp. Inside, there were 2 items. The first would have been the promissory note, a single sheet of yellowed, brittle paper, folded and unfolded so many times the creases were as soft as cloth. The astronomical sum, the damning interest rate, my father's desperate, florid signature at the bottom. The weapon that had started everything, the instrument of my sale. Now, it was just a worthless, historical artifact, a museum piece from a private, 2-man hell. The second item was a letter, several pages long, handwritten on my father's personal stationery. My father, even in death, was a master of control and cruel irony. He could have destroyed the confession. He could have sought some kind of absolution before he died. He did neither. Instead, he set a time bomb, timed to my abuser's own birthday, a final, pathetic attempt to have the last word, to prove that he, too, had been a victim of a bargain he had authored. Albright would have read the words, and the last of his world would have collapsed into dust. He would have read my father's weak, self-pitying account of the financial ruin, the shame, the terror of losing everything. He would have read my father's hatred for the Albright family for holding such power over him. But then he would have read the even deeper, more venomous self-hatred for what he had done. For his cowardice, for looking the other way, for sacrificing his own daughter and then blaming her for the price. It was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a suicide note for the soul, mailed 30 years late. It contained no apology to me. I was merely the currency in their transaction, the collateral damage in the war between 2 weak and wicked men. The letter was an accounting of my father's own torment, a detailed map of the private hell he had built for himself. It was one monster reaching out from the grave to confirm the damnation of another. It offered no closure, no peace. It was simply the final, ugly receipt for a transaction paid for with my life. Albright was left sitting in his silent house with the evidence. Not evidence for a court of law, but for a court of one. The public would have the story of his crimes, immortalized in the cool, objective prose of my son's book. And he, in the privacy of his own home, would have this. A confirmation from his co-conspirator, a testament to their shared, squalid sin. I did not need to see the letter. I did not need to know its exact words. I knew the hearts of those 2 men. That night, as I watched the sun set over the quiet rooftops of Maple Creek, I felt a stillness settle over me, a peace I had not known since I was a girl who believed in the goodness of her father. The ghosts of the past were no longer my burden to carry. They were now left to haunt each other, trapped together for eternity in the pages of a history book and the ink of a will that had waited decades to be read.